Let me tell you something that should make every American stop and think for a moment. More than $34 trillion in national debt, and that number is ticking up every second, and here is the truth nobody wants to say out loud. That kind of debt is not just unsustainable, it is a ticking time bomb set to go off in our lifetime, maybe even in the very near future. Now, I am not talking about that vague someday down the road kind of explosion. I am talking about a concrete, dangerous reality that we are walking into with our eyes wide open, and yet pretending we are asleep. What we have done over the past few decades is remarkable, and I do not mean in a good way. We have built an entire economy on a foundation of borrowed money. We have pushed off our obligations to the next generation, pretending as though we can kick the can down the road forever, but that road is coming to an end, and we are not ready for what waits at the edge. Our leaders, whether they admit it or not, have spent money we do not have on programs we cannot sustain and promises we cannot keep. And what happens when a nation does that for long enough is not just economic crisis, it is a full-blown collapse of credibility, power, and global standing. You see, the issue is not just that we owe money, the issue is that we have tied our entire financial and political system to the illusion that we will somehow always be good for it, never default, never really struggle, never lose our place in the global pecking order. But reality does not work like that, and neither do the markets or other nations, especially those who are watching us closely with their own interests at heart and their own ambitions waiting for a moment of weakness. When a country borrows more than it can produce, more than it can repay, and more than it can even imagine paying back, it sends a signal not just to its citizens, but to the world that it is losing control, that it no longer has the discipline to manage itself. Debt ceiling debates, the government shutdown threats, the endless borrowing without a clear plan, all of it paints a picture that the United States, once the standard of strength and solvency, is slipping, and the world sees it. Make no mistake, they are watching, and they are preparing. Some people still try to make the argument that the US dollar is the global reserve currency, and that gives us a kind of immunity. Let me tell you, that is dangerous thinking, because nothing lasts forever, not empires, not currencies, not power. When the trust starts to erode, when investors worry that we cannot pay them back without printing worthless money, when trading partners look for more stable arrangements, possibly dropping the dollar in favor of more controlled alternatives, we enter territory we have never been to before, and the pressure builds quietly until one day the dam breaks. Our GDP is barely keeping up with our debt. And I know that sounds like just another economic metric, but this is life and death. This is how we fund our defense, our schools, our infrastructure. And when the interest payments alone start eating up the federal budget, there is less and less money left over for everything else. We have already reached the point where interest is one of the largest government expenses, and it is not producing anything. It is just the cost of staying afloat. Real people are going to suffer when it all starts to unravel, because when the government cannot borrow the way it used to, when credit dries up, when inflation surges or crashes, when the dollar weakens, it will be the working class who will pay the highest price. It will be the small business owners struggling to keep their doors open, the low-income families watching prices soar, the retirees seeing their savings vanish, and there will be no bail out big enough to fix it, no program big enough to protect everyone from the fallout. This is the part we do not want to hear, but we need to say it anyway. The consequences of this debt crisis will not stop at our borders. We are not just risking our own collapse, we are inviting a chain reaction around the globe, because when the biggest economy starts to fall, everything tied to it begins to shake and tremble and crack. Countries that depend on our markets, that count on our stability, will feel the ripples. And in a world where economic pain and political instability often go hand In hand, this is how wars begin slowly, quietly, then all at once. We cannot keep pretending that this is someone else's problem, or that it will fix itself. It will not. The choices we have made have consequences, and the weight of those choices is growing heavier every single day. And when the burden can no longer be carried, when the money runs out, or the trust collapses, or the enemies we have kept at bay sense their moment, the results will not be contained, and they will not be peaceful. It only takes one crack to break a dam. Let me walk you through something we sometimes forget when we look at charts and numbers and percentages and politicians arguing on TV. We forget that money and war have always been close companions. If history teaches us anything, it is that economic instability does not stay in the financial pages. It spills into the streets, into homes, into governments, and eventually into battlefields. What starts as a debt crisis can very easily turn into a global conflict. Because when times get hard, nations like people will do desperate things. Economic strain has a way of revealing what power really means when money gets tight, when banks falter, when currencies weaken and trust evaporates. Governments start looking outside their borders for solutions, and sometimes what they find is conflict and confrontation, not because it is the best option, but because it is the only one. They believe they have left. Debt is not just a ledger, it is a window into national strength, and when that ledger goes red long enough, the world starts to rethink who is in charge. Look back at the past. The greatest conflicts civilization has ever seen were always tied to the economy. The Great Depression set the stage for World War. Two hungry, angry, unemployed citizens are fertile ground for dangerous leaders and bad ideas. Economic collapse fractured Europe, made people turn to extremism, pushed nations to invade one another, looking for resources, looking for revenge, looking just to survive. Anyone who says it can't happen again has not been paying attention. The triggers are different now, but the human story has not changed today. The United States is entering dangerous territory. We are not just printing money, we are living in denial about where that takes us, and other nations are watching. They are measuring, they are planning. When superpowers grow weak, others start to circle. And it's not just our enemies who get nervous, even our allies start second-guessing their loyalties. When the foundation shakes, the whole structure begins to sway. If countries no longer believe the United States can back its word with economic muscle and military force, they will start making new alliances. And those alliances often lead to new rivalries and new wars. Let me tell you what happens. When the balance of power begins to shift, you see cracks, at first small ones. A nation increases its military drills in disputed waters. A regime announces a surprise alliance, an invasion here, a land claim. Their smart people in quiet rooms start asking, how much longer can the United States really hold its position? And when that question gains traction, the world gets cold and dangerous fast, and all because we could not live within our means. Now, some will argue this is just fear, mongering that every country borrows and spends, that debt is normal, but that thinking is short-sighted. Because we are not in a normal situation, we are the cornerstone of the global economy. We have been the stabilizer, the backbone, the guarantor. When our economic health falters, the system we built begins to unravel. The dollar loses standing. Markets panic. Rival philosophies of governance rise to fill the vacuum, and suddenly peace becomes harder to maintain. Look around at the tension on every continent. Flashpoints are everywhere, and the one thread barely holding it all together is belief that the United States can still be counted on to lead, to intervene, to protect its interests and those of its partners. But that belief is tied directly to our financial strength. And when our finances collapse, so too does our influence, and without that influence the temperature rises, and when people burn, they fight. Economic hardship also has a way of turning inward. When a nation begins falling apart from the inside, it sometimes looks for enemies on the outside to blame, and it is a pattern as old as time. Struggling economies lead to social unrest, and unrest often leads to nationalist rhetoric, isolationist policies. and in many cases war not because the people want it, but because weak leaders need it to maintain control, to create a common enemy, to distract from the painful truth that they have failed to protect what really matters. There is a restlessness in the world right now, and many can't feel it. Nations are arming up, trust is eroding, hostility is rising. Top economists and defense experts are no longer speaking in maybes, they are speaking in whens, and the question we ought to be asking is what breaks first, and when it does, who will be ready to pick up the pieces? Because if we keep spending like this, if we keep ignoring the warnings, if we keep assuming that being America is enough, then the answer might be that someone else gets to reshape the world. And that is a frightening thought, not because of pride, but because of responsibility. With great power comes the duty to maintain peace, stability, order, and right now we are compromising that responsibility with every trillion we add to our debt. And when that debt stops just being ours and starts being the world's problem, expect the world to react, and history tells us exactly how that story ends when voices are ignored and warnings are buried under comfort and distraction. The storm that follows feels like it came from nowhere, but it never does. Here is what a lot of Americans do not realize: the world does not just watch us, it depends on us. And not in a symbolic feel-good kind of way, I mean in a real, concrete financial way. The global economy is pegged to the strength of the United States. Everything from oil prices to international loans to trade agreements is built on the assumption that America is a stable force, that the dollar is strong and trustworthy, that our government functions well enough to keep its promises and pay its debts on time. And when that picture starts to unravel, everything gets shaky fast. Think about this, because it is not something they teach you in school. There are countries all over the world that hold our debt. They buy our treasury bonds because it has always been considered the safest place to put your money. And when they buy those bonds, when they hold those dollars, their own economies become tied to our financial system and to our financial behavior. So when we take on massive debt, when we look unstable, when we flirt with default or government shutdown or financial chaos, it is not just us who suffer, it is everybody else who has put their faith and their money into us. This is not just about numbers on a screen, this is about trust, global trust. And if that trust begins to die, it is not just the value of the dollar that crashes, it is the order of trade, diplomacy, finance, and cooperation that begins to fall apart. Because when the foundation crumbles, the whole house goes with it. That is the danger. Nobody wants to say out loud the danger that the debt crisis we are creating at home could cascade through banking systems around the world, through import and export deals, through global stock markets, through savings accounts in countries thousands of miles away. And when that reach starts to choke the lifeblood out of global trade, what will be left behind is panic. It does not take much to set it off. One bad vote in Congress, one missed payment, one credit downgrade, and then boom, the dominoes fall. Investors pull out, markets dive, banks lose liquidity, countries scramble to protect themselves from the fallout, and old alliances begin to strain under the pressure, because in a crisis it is every nation for itself. And when that happens, we stop being the anchor, we stop being the example, and we start being the cause of instability, and that leads others, some waiting patiently, some waiting angrily, to step into the space we leave behind. You have to understand that global peace right now is not just being held in place by armies or policies, but by the mutual benefit everyone gets from a working system. That system has America at its center, not from force, but from faith. And if that faith starts to fade, the incentives to keep things peaceful, to keep things fair, to keep things steady start to disappear too. What comes next is usually not negotiation or caution, it is escalation and conflict, because that is what history shows us happens. Every time the backbone country starts to bend until it breaks, our closest allies count on us, not just for security assistance, but for economic stability, and our fiercest competitors are betting that we are too distracted, too divided, and too addicted to debt to notice that they are advancing their own interests, while we bury ourselves deeper every year. And once the scales tip, once the confidence breaks, once the world decides that hedging against the United States is smarter than relying on it, the chain reaction does not stop until it hits the ground. And by then, it is too late to say we should have seen this coming. You see, it is not just about whether we can pay back what we owe. It is about what our willingness to borrow without discipline says about who we have become and what kind of nation we are passing down. And the rest of the world is silently asking themselves, if we can no longer govern our own finances, can we still be trusted with so much global influence? And if not, then who takes our place, and what will that world look like? I do not think it looks good. When debt begins to drag down the nation, it does not just make us weaker, it makes the entire framework we are holding up more vulnerable. And when that framework includes global food supply chains, health systems, military alliances, and currency reserves, it becomes clearer and clearer that what we do in Washington does not stay in Washington. People are hurting all across the globe already. And if we think that our reckless borrowing is not accelerating their suffering, then we are not only naive, we are part of the harm. This is how financial decisions made in comfort cause real misery in places we will never see, and that misery builds frustration, and frustration turns to anger, and anger becomes action. And in a hyper-connected world, those actions very often turn into weapons, into conflicts, into wars, because when stability goes, hunger comes, fear comes, desperation comes, and with it a thirst for power, resources, revenge, or simply control over life again. And that is what collapses the thin layer of peace holding the world together. Global trust is not a right, it is a responsibility, and right now we are breaking that trust by showing the world we cannot even manage our own books. And if we break that too many times, we do not just lose the trust, we lose the future, one brutal shock at a time. And when the world stops believing in us, it stops listening too at some point. We have to stop pretending that this is just about economics, just about numbers and interest rates and fiscal projections. Because what we are living through right now is not just a financial crisis. It is a moral and spiritual crisis. It is a reflection of who we have become as a nation, and maybe more importantly, who we have stopped being. We keep talking about the debt as if it is only a math problem, but in truth the debt is a mirror, and what it is showing us right now is something we should not ignore. When a people lose the ability to govern their appetites, when a nation can no longer say no to itself, when every problem looks like it can be solved by printing more money, that is not an economic issue, that is a character issue. It is a sign that we have traded wisdom for convenience, that we have let go of self-control, discipline, honesty, and sacrifice. We are living in a time where the values that once guided generations through war, depression, civil unrest, and spiritual darkness have been replaced with entitlement, distraction, and a desperate need for instant gratification. We borrow more because we want more, not because we need it. We build systems on short-term wins rather than long-term strength. We elect leaders who promise the easy road even when it is clear that road leads us over a cliff. And we know this, we all feel this deep down, yet we keep choosing comfort over conviction and security over truth. And now we are watching as the natural consequences of those choices play out before our eyes. The idea of debt used to carry a weight, a seriousness. It was something we avoided, something we respected, just like how we used to treat truth, just like how we used to treat morality. But now we treat debt not as a warning, but as a tool. We use it without conscience, we increase it without thought, we defend it without shame. And if you think that kind of attitude only stays in the halls of Congress or the boardrooms of Wall Street, then you have not looked around lately, because that same mindset is showing up in our homes, our schools, our culture. Everywhere the values of a nation are always revealed in how it handles blessing and responsibility, and what we are revealing is that we have forgotten what those words mean. We have taken blessing and turned it into greed. We have taken responsibility and passed it down the line. We are borrowing from our children to fund our desires, and that should disturb every soul in this country. We say we love freedom, we say we care about the future, but our actions reflect something entirely different, and the world sees that too, because here is the thing: the collapse of a nation rarely begins with bombs or battles. It almost always begins with a slow, quiet decay from within, a corrosion of values, a drifting away from truth. And once that takes hold, what follows is not just economic collapse, but cultural confusion, moral weakness, and spiritual blindness. And when those three things walk in together, they bring chaos with them. Look around you right now and try to tell me we are not already feeling it: the divisions, the anger, the violence, the anxiety, the loss of purpose, the rise of addiction, the coldness between neighbors. All of it points not to a population struggling with inflation, but to a population struggling with meaning. You cannot fix that with policy. You cannot fix that with a better tax code. You fix that by returning to the things that built us in the first place: humility, accountability, faith, sacrifice, love of neighbor, love of truth. We used to be a people that understood struggle as part of shaping the soul. Now we avoid struggle at all costs, and in doing so we have lost the very thing that made us strong. And now, after decades of excess, we stand at a crossroads. One path leads to comfort for a little bit longer, and then collapse. The other path is hard, humbling, slow, but it leads toward healing, both financially and spiritually. But we cannot walk that second path if we are not willing to take ownership of what we have done and what we have become. We have to face the truth that our debt is not just an economic statistic, it is a national confession. It says we could not delay our gratification. It says we could not lead with courage. It says we failed, and if we do not own that, it will own us. At the root of all of this is not money. It is trust, not just the world's trust in us, but our trust in something bigger than all this noise, something righteous, something eternal. Without that, we are just another empire chasing an illusion until it all collapses and the world writes a new chapter without us in it. Because when a nation loses its soul, it will eventually lose everything else too.